Welcome, everybody. We are glad that you've joined us for the Canadian Practical Theology Network. Tonight is one of our learning nights, so we are going to be listening to Phil Zylla share a little bit about the program at McMaster and how it started, and sort of a bit of a primer on practical theology across Canada. So we're looking forward to that. For those of you who are jumping on now, just so you know, we are going to be recording the session. It's already in progress. So if you feel more comfortable with your camera off, you're welcome to do that. The way the night's going to go is I'm going to introduce Phil, and then he's going to take the floor and share his talk with us. And then after that, we've set aside some time for question and answers with Phil, and Dale will be moderating that. So he'll take over after Phil completes his talk. Okay. And if you have questions or anything, you can always pop them into the chat as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Phil, and then we're going to pass the floor off to him. So Phil Zylla is the professor of practical theology or pastoral theology and the J. Gordon and Margaret Warnock Jones Chair. Ooh, that's a mouthful. In church and ministry at McMaster Divinity College. He holds a Doctor of Theology in Practical Theology degree from the University of South Africa, Pretoria. Phil's research interests include Christian spirituality, pastoral care, theology of suffering, and various themes related to congregational ministry. Before coming to McMaster Divinity College in the fall of 2007, Phil was the principal of the Acts Seminaries of Trinity Western University from 2001 to 2007. And he had served at 3 churches as lead pastor in Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. Before that, he is married to Melody, and he lives in Ancaster, Ontario. So welcome, Phil. Thanks for taking the time with us, and we'll pass it on.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me. I'm excited to share this evening with you and to have this conversation. I'm going to be screen sharing a PowerPoint, so I'm going to try to put that up. Okay, good. So again, thanks for the invitation. Great to meet all of you here. Many faces I recognize from various engagements with the DPT program or our college in general. And I look forward to the conversation. I'll try to not be too wordy or too, extensive in my comments. I just want to briefly respond to the questions I was asked to sketch out sort of how McMaster Divinity College leaned into the development of the Doctor of Practical Theology degree, its importance, why we went that direction, and what some of the thinking was at that time. And then what is the state of play in the Canadian context in practical theology. Jim Gaffigan came on the stage for a comedy routine, and people were cheering and laughing and clapping, and he came on and he said, just lower your expectations. So I guess that's my opening thoughts. I probably don't have anything too profound to say, but I hope it'll spark some conversation, so I'll try to leave as much time for that as I can. So let me start with just some thoughts about practical theology. Some of you might have heard me talk about these things. Rather than give a definition of practical theology, I outlined here some features of practical theology that are important to me, or that animate my work and make it exciting every day. And so I want to share these ideas as kind of a starting point, and maybe you can see yourself and your research agenda attached to some of these features. The idea of ecclesial imagination is from Craig Dykstra, who talks about having a deep, sustained engagement with issues related to ecclesial concerns. And I share that vision of practical theology. Curiosity, what's underneath something? Why is this emerging? A lot of my own thinking about practical theology comes from my own years of being a pastor, but at a more epistemic level, what is it that we can understand about these issues? Of course, theological reflection is still a mainstay idea in practical theology, and there's been so many good resources built around that. Swinton and Mowatt's idea of excavation of situations captures my imagination, that practical theology is always sort of trying to recover and deeply understand what's underneath something. And so many methods have been developed: ethnography, case study method, action theories, to help with that process of excavation. I like Callahan and Neiman's idea of discernment and proposal, to discern what is the situation, and to discern what might be, so that there's a present and a future dimension to our research. And then concreteness, the idea that practical theology is not abstract and distant philosophy separated from life, but rather it's rooted in actual situations, and is comfortable with ambiguity and with the complexity of situations, which is the next idea, complexity. You all know about Swinton and Mowatt's word, complexify, the multivalent situation. I just love that. And I think that sometimes theology is too simplistic and needs that refresher on that point. I think relevance can be a tricky point. It can mean trying to be relevant. That's not what I'm interested in, but who's the audience for the research that I'm doing? I think that might be an important question. Whatever stage of research you're invested in, who's the audience? Who needs to know this? Who's interested in this? I think that's an important part of our development as practical theologians. And then finally, congruity, which to me is about a kind of phronesis, a way of seeing and being that has congruity, not necessarily integration. That I think that word gets overused. I like the idea of congruity as kind of a goal or aim of practical theology. So these are just sort of markers of how I approach my own research and how I teach about these things. I thought about the impetus for the DPT program and just some quick observations. One was that we noticed a tremendous innovation in church and church-related ministries. Innovation doesn't equal growth. The church is, in a lot of ways in Canada, shrinking. But at the same time, there's an enormous creativity that's happening on the ground in congregations and churches and denominations. There's a lot of renewal efforts. There's a lot of subgroups that are emerging. And we noticed this, and we just sort of paid attention to that. In addition, there had been a surge in new positions and ways of being a professional Christian leader. It wasn't just to be a pastor of a congregation. There were many emerging leaders in various contexts. And we noticed this, and we wondered if the traditional paths of education were going to meet that need. Also, the traditional models of theological education for professionals had not really changed much since the 1960s. The pattern of the MDiv and 3 years of experience and a DMin seemed to be the robust sort of pathway in the Canadian professional doctorate. plan. And we wondered if that was the future or if that was something that was now starting to wane. I would say we did an international search, not necessarily for models, but it ended up being that we wanted to see what was being done elsewhere. And in particular, we looked to the UK and things that were happening there. And the one sort of premise that we built off of was that we already had a reputation for academic excellence. Excellent. So we really wanted to build our program with the idea of rigor around it, that the research agenda attached to the DPT had that. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Some of the things that I was observing and we talked about as faculty and administration was some of the bullets in on this slide, that we noticed that we're late adopters in Canada to congregational research and ethnographic study of congregations. There's like a gold mine there of things happening, but there wasn't a lot of research being done. And now that's changed in the last 10 years. But at the time, 2007, 2008, when we started to develop this program, there wasn't much being done. The expansion of professional roles I've already mentioned, but that also required a different vision of professional ministry that was often used. Very few innovations had happened in the professional doctorate. I was part of starting the DMin program at Axe Seminaries. And at the time, the innovation was to add kind of leadership and spiritual formation as kind of the markers of professional doctoral training. And Tyndale Seminary basically did the same thing. We almost merged our two programs together because they were so similar. And we had several conversations about whether they should be the one program across Canada. But the ideas underneath that were sort of more about pastoral development than they were about research. And so that's kind of one of the sort of main lacunas that we noticed, that there wasn't enough research being done on and for the church. And so how could we change that? How could we facilitate a more active research agenda? We also listened to, particularly, these are some of my mentors. I always think it's important, if you don't know something, to ask smart people what they think. And I knew some smart people in theological education. Don Capps was my mentor for my THM and also for my doctorate. And one day I took him aside. I said, "What have you noticed in the field of practical theology or pastoral theology that in the last 30 years, excuse me?" These are the three things he said. The more things change, the more things stay the same. So all the new ideas, new impetus, new sort of protocols, new methods were things that had been proposed before in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. Nothing new under the sun. The second one really stuck with me. Practical theology has gone a mile wide and an inch deep, and I wish that it would go an inch wide and a mile deep. And that really, I really heard that. And I could see in his own research, Capps in his lifetime wrote 40 books and over 250 journal articles. So he was a prolific scholar. And he didn't go very wide. He did go deep. And so he practiced what he preached. And I think that's instructive for all of us. And then his comment, roughly summarized, was that our research should benefit pastors and Christian leaders on the ground, and we should have their interests in mind. Not every practical theologian has that concern. I happen to share that concern. And I think that a lot of our work in practical theology could benefit. Dan Elshire, I failed to put his name up on here. He was the executive director of ATS for some 25 years and a key leader in Christian higher education. He asked the question, are things becoming less or more complex in Christian ministry? And this was in 2008. And again, that really grabbed my attention because obviously it's become more complex. Now we've had a pandemic and complexity is part of everything. So he says the present moment calls on theological schools to emphasize some things that have been present, but in the shadows, for them to do some of the things that the church used to do, so there will be a future in which the church might be able to remember its task. The way that theological education has been done, sophisticated and valuable for one day, is not adequate to the tasks required by a new day. And I heard that and I took that to heart. Many of you will know Reg Bibby. He's one of the sort of most well-known Canadian sociologists of religion, Lethbridge University. We had him at a conference when I was principal at Axe. And I took him aside. I said, Reg, when pastors talk about the engagement of church and culture, what do you think they mean by that? And he said, I haven't the foggiest idea what they think they mean. He said, there is no such thing as a culture to adopt. There are many competing cultures. And so that was another instructive lens for me to think about the complexity of church in Canada and some of the competing ideas. He also has a different view of secularization that he says the data that we're gathering is documenting a different story rather than Canada becoming more secular. What we're noticing is we have a core who are explicitly rejecting religion. We have a core that is very vibrant in their faith. And we have a third sector, probably the biggest, who are in between, neither rejecting or embracing. Very interesting kind of nuance on secularization. I only have one slide because I don't know a lot about practical theology in Canada. So this is my attempt to say, here's the big picture as I see it. I think we have a lot of silos. There's a lot of people working in practical theology in their own region, in their own school, in their own denomination, but they're all siloed. They're not really connected to each other. So I noticed at the University of Manitoba, they had a ecclesiology and ethnography conference twice in 2018 and again in 2019 with the affiliated schools at the University of Manitoba that are theological schools. And that was connected to the work of Pete Ward in the UK. And so that was happening, but there wasn't really a connection between other regions for that conference to sort of take root in Canada. Pam Couture is, I think, the co-editor for the International Journal of Practical Theology. So she's a major leader in Canadian practical theology. But again, if you're not in the TST circle, it's pretty hard to get time with each other in terms of working together. There's a DPT program in Laval, but it's all in French and there's not a lot of overlap. There's people teaching in other disciplines like sociology of religion and anthropology that are doing similar things, and yet there's not a cohesive way of sharing these things. So that's my first observation, is a lot's being done all in silos. I would include myself in that, and our school. There's a range of DMin programs across Canada. I name some of the bigger ones here, but these still primarily are oriented to the preferred or core theological streams. So they're divided around conservative theology or more open theology and follow denominational lines very much. So there's not a lot of integration across Canada. There was a DMin program directors meeting, but I think it's sort of fallen by the wayside. It doesn't, I don't think it meets anymore, or if it does, it's not very dynamic. And then other observations, I noticed Regent College is doing more courses in practical theology than they've ever done. They call themselves an unseminary. I don't know if they still use that tagline, but they are interested in arts and music and marketplace theology, and they have more practical theologians on their faculty. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think a lot of work is being done, a lot of good work, a lot is being produced, but it's not a very cohesive picture when you look across the nation. Back in 2008, this is the program of BIAPT in 2009, but I'm going back to how we started at McMaster Divinity College getting involved in DPT thinking. And I went to BIAPT in 2008. This is the 2009 agenda. But in 2008, I said, I'm not British or Irish, I'm Canadian. Am I okay to be here? And they laughed and they welcomed me and they said, you know, come back and bring your students. And so we started doing that in 2009 and beyond. And I just noticed as I went through the programs that I gave a conference reflection at this 2009 session. And I just want to read you an excerpt of what I said in that opening session. I talked about passion for practical theology, a perspective of practical theology, and then the posture of practical theology. And I just want to read an excerpt about posture. In a sense, I think this is an important dimension of the spiritual task of practical theology. There's a time after concentrated participation in the Missio Dei to simply sit down and wait. This is all based on the book of Jonah. We need to make a shelter in the shade and watch carefully as the unfolding mystery of God's ways in the world teach us more about grace and more about the abounding love of God who relents from sending calamity. This task apparently needs little more from us than disengagement. And yet, because of the surging emotional needs that ministry demands, this may be one of the most difficult tasks in our work. We like to fix things. We trust our pragmatism and our initiatives seem right to us. We're like the disciples working hard all night. The call to sit quietly and watch is counterintuitive. As we reflect in these days on what we can do, it may serve us well to pay attention to the posture of waiting. While our efforts might be well-intentioned, there are times for us to get out of the way, to be still, and to wait in the shade. And then I go on and have a few following comments. So I said that in 2009. It's 2023. I think I've waited pretty long. I think that the generative things that have emerged out of these early conversations really have been very fruitful. And I think the right posture was not wait and see, but wait and participate with God on what needs to be done in the Canadian scene. I had to move a little faster. In 2015, we wrote for a grant to support the work we're doing, particularly to train our faculty in practice-led research. So we made a proposal to ATS for a grant that would contribute to the future of advanced theological education to transform the professional doctoral program and to be a catalyst for other educational institutions in search of new models of professional doctoral study. And they gave us the grant, and we were able to use that to catalyze a lot of things in our program. The aims at that time for the program were to galvanize the entire faculty around practice-led research. So we didn't want just practical theologians. We wanted Hebrew Bible scholars and New Testament scholars and theologians to be able to teach in the discipline of practical theology through their own lens. We also wanted an innovative model that expand the use of technology. This was pre-COVID. We were already exploring how we would do hybrid teaching and utilize technology. And we wanted to cast a wider net to non-traditional professional students. So people in various support roles or NGOs or admissions or artists, poets. We wanted to really cast a wide net. And we wanted a program that would be generative in producing practice-led researchers. So I talked about rigor, and the next few slides are just some slides that I shared with doctoral programs across North America that were professional doctoral programs in Christian universities or colleges, which included, education, nursing, theology, and other things. And some of the thoughts about rigor were the focal points of my presentation there. R. Nelson, in his book Toward a History of Rigor, says, though a cornerstone of all research and evaluation, rigor in scholarship is a relatively recent concept which is poorly defined and never interrogated. In his article on the history of rigor, he talks about the origins of rigor as a negative concept of punishment, intense labor, harshness, such as that was imposed by on the Jews in Egypt, and that ordeal affected Job. So it's kind of like rigor is equal to really punishing work, and that became the kind of standard. And maybe that's what some faculty think of when they think of rigor. But of course, everyone wants their program to be rigorous, but that was primarily being defined in doctoral programs as cogency of argument and evidence-based research. So then the question was, with professional doctorates, how could we increase our focus on rigor without going back to bricks out of straw kind of mentality and our attempts to make it too rigorous? Some of the common distinctions in professional doctorates in the research that I did is that professional doctorates should not be marginalized or have less rigor than the PhD. Not a second-class doctorate, not a watered-down PhD. It shouldn't be considered PhD light. It should be in its own research agenda. It should have integrity. And the distinction is often made between a professional researcher in a professional doctorate and a research professional in a PhD. And while that's true, the literature is saying that there needs to be a better curricula to differentiate between these two types of doctoral study. And I think we're still working that out. Someone mentioned in our conversation during those weeks that it took 40 years for the PsyD to mature after breaking from the PhD in clinical psychology. So it takes time for these big educational shifts to become rooted. In second generation professional doctorates, these are primarily in other areas, business and nursing and other places. An increased importance was attached to practice-based or practice-led research, more collaboration in the workplace, more portfolio approaches to assessment, and then mode 2 knowledge, which is context-driven transformational knowledge as opposed to traditional research in PhD programs. All these doctoral questions about rigor um, call forth a real intensive reflection. And over the years that we've had this program, we've taken many efforts to make sure that we remain rigorous, but that rigor doesn't mean it looks like a PhD research project. Have we accomplished the aims of our DPT program? We're now, what, 8, 10 years into our program. I think we noticed that our graduates are making a direct contribution in the field of practical theology, both in publishing and in professional engagement with the church and church-related ministries. The diversity of our professional foci in our student body is remarkable. Pastors, artists, chaplains, I went through all those students, leaders of Christian agencies, business leaders, educators, professional lay leaders, missional leaders, denominational leaders, church innovators, church planters. About 1 in 5 of our DPT students are women. So we have a strong presence of women leaders in our DPT. And the demand for the program is still there. We have 52 current students, most of whom self-select into this program because of its methodological choices. So I think those are all good things. Last couple slides. What are my hopes for aspirations for our DPT graduates? I would like to see more scholarship for the church emerge from our graduates. I'd like to see deliberate Canadian research spurred on by conferences and events that facilitate mature theological reflection on issues of import. I'd like to see a Canadian Journal of Practical Theology at some point. I'd like to see our graduates take up teaching positions in seminaries and Christian colleges, more practitioner researchers that are teaching. And then I think the expansion of this network, the Canadian Practical Theology Network, with official conferences every 2 years, maybe alternating with the International Association of Practical Theology, because they meet every 2 years on the alternate year. Maybe we could get Canadians together in a broader way. Some bright spots are the guild development. Many of you are part of these societies. I'm participating in all of these except for the International Academy, which is a story. But I think that there's a lot going on that's worth being part of. I thought it was great that this Center for Ecclesiology and Ethnography had something in Canada, and maybe we can get Pete Ward and his team back. I noticed they're going to Durham this spring, so they're having a conference in North Carolina, but maybe they'll come back to Canada. And then I like that Ambrose University has the Flourishing Congregations Institute. It's mostly driven by sociology, but I think there's a lot of parallel interests in the kinds of research that's going on there. Last slide. It's a young discipline, so we need to be patient with how it emerges. We need goals for the next 5 or 10 years. Much more direct collaboration is required by teaching faculty in Canada, but also across denominational and theological lines. And then without a cohort model, I think we need to keep cultivating research clusters. I think that's an area of mentoring and supporting each other that can facilitate creative research and practical theology. So that's my overview and brief sketch of the topic that I've been assigned. So I'd love to hear from you now.
Just switching it back to gallery view so that it's a little bit easier for people to see everybody. If you want to put a question in chat, you can. It's probably easier if you ask it yourself. we ask that you raise your hands physically here through the reaction panel. I think it is at the bottom. Yeah. And that way we can take them in the order they come in. Interesting enough, we are a special interest group of BIAPT, but when we had the conversation with, and I forget the guy's name now off the top of my head, when we had the conversation with the BIAPT people, their vision actually kind of aligned with some of the stuff Phil already said about this becoming its own entity eventually, and publishing, even if we piggyback on them, publishing our own journal as well. So it's obviously not going to be next week, but it's in the dreaming process right now. So it's encouraging to read some of that stuff. If you have a question, again, raise your hand. I have one question. So I noticed that some, and I don't want to disparage them, but some demons are light, to say, lack of a better word. I appreciated the rigor of the DPT program, because I didn't want a light program. So why did you, I mean, you've kind of explained a little bit, but can you just restate why the school chose to go make it a professional degree versus an academic degree?
Well, we
just
already had a
looking, go ahead.
PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah, we already had a PhD. So, and that was flourishing, and we didn't want to interrupt that. And we still have the option for people in practical theology and ministry studies to do the PhD. So we still want that, and people that feel called particularly to teaching and research should do the PhD. But we also, there was a clear sense that we didn't want to do a DMin. The McMaster Divinity College used to have a DMin. It wasn't very successful. There were a lot of adjunct supervisors. There were a lot of unfinished dissertations. It just wasn't making any money. It wasn't sustainable. So we didn't want to get back into that. And, you know, I think with the DMin program, I think it suits people who really want more of a professional development experience than it does to become a practitioner researcher. And I think most of the DMin director, the presentation on rigor that I did, there were 40 DMin directors in the audience. And, you know, I wasn't trying to disparage anything that they're doing, but they all said basically, yeah, we don't have that level of rigor in our research requirements. I think at TST, there's a 1-credit course on research methods. So, you know, I think you can only learn so much in that. So I don't know if that answers the question, Dale, but I think for us, it was just trying to, like, what is really needed to be generative, not only for people to graduate, but to become researchers where they have the confidence that the work that they're doing can continue, and that they can work and publish and do the kind of work that is needed. So that was the hope, that was the desire. I think so far we've seen good results.
I believe so as well. Speaking as a graduate, I guess, but I believe it fit my niche, what I was looking for. I didn't want the DMin experience, but I did want some. I couldn't do the PhD because of just I couldn't dedicate that time away. So this was a sweet spot for me, right?
That's kind of what we're hearing from most of our new students as well, that they sort of self-selected into this program. Didn't want to do a residential PhD, but yeah.
I know Deborah had a question here in chat. Is the church handling complexity by simplifying and becoming more fundamentalist and set on tradition?
Well, yeah, especially the evangelical church, or the conservative evangelical wing of the evangelical church. So yeah, there's all kinds of polls towards simplicity or simplistic city. It's a problem. Yeah, it's a real issue. And I don't think the way to fight that is to champion open theology, but rather to, again, think together about what is really needed at the grassroots in terms of the kinds of changes and the shape of ministry and what's required to really nurture that. Given the ecosystems that we do have are failing us, we have a lot of work to do. So I'm surprised that we're regressing in some of these areas, but I do think that maybe a more galvanized effort, even across denominational lines and theological lines, could, break through in some ways.
So how do we get people out of their silos, I guess would be the question.
Yeah,
You
I
use the
think
word
get out
silos.
of your silo.
Yeah.
Don't just talk to your own denominational people. That's what I would say, first of all. For us as evangelicals, I think that's a problem. We're too much about our tribe and not about the tribe right beside us. And I think that's problematic. We need the Mennonite perspective, and the Mennonites need to hear from Baptists and so on. So I loved Acts when I was there, because there was, at the time, 6 denominations that were sort of working collaboratively. I thought that was fruitful. It's eroded now down to 4. So we're going the wrong direction. So yeah, I don't know, Deborah, that doesn't answer your question, but I think you probably already had an answer to that.
Anybody else have a question? If you want to either raise your hand or unmute yourself and go now. So that I can continue on my line of questioning, and I don't want to monopolize, so just want to make sure. Again, we want to make sure. Paul, you have a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, it's just yeah, it's not an especially profound question, but just a curiosity. Why do you, in your development, were there any reasons that you found why practical theology seems to have developed, particularly in the UK, and seems to not be as developed as you would expect in USA?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. I think that a lot of the work in the US was tied with other disciplines like psychology of religion or sociology of religion. And so Nancy Emmerman was a sociologist, and her work was important. And now there's a Center for Practical Theology at Boston University that really is under her wing. But at the time, it was a sociology department, so it wasn't really in the sphere. The Association of Practical Theology was not very, if I can use this word, friendly to emerging scholars. It was kind of all about, come and hear us talk, and all the experts will tell you how it is. And it really wasn't very friendly environment for emerging scholars. And so the UK just had more friendliness in that particular attitude. If you look carefully at that slide that I put up of 2009, they talk about how they're welcoming emerging scholars, and they really want to support people that are doing practical theology. And what I found, and some of you who went to BIAPT could share this too, I found that to be true. I found that they nurtured emerging scholars, and they really had a belief that by doing so, they would flourish in the field. One of the emerging scholars that I witnessed during my first 5 years of BIAPT was Helen Cameron. She was doing her professional doctorate. Helen has now written, I think, 6 books in practical theology, and she's a global leader. But she was kind of nurtured in an environment of support that just said, go for it and we'll support you. And so I think that was a big part of it, is just the attitudinal thing. And it's actually why I didn't join IAPT, because for the same reasons of, scholarly snobbery and exclusivism, I couldn't see myself participating in that, even though I have good friends that are active members of that. That's changed now, but we're talking 2008, right? So at that time, it was, you have to be sponsored by someone and prove your value as a scholar and blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, okay, but maybe there's other ways to do that. But
Go ahead.
BIAPT is in person this year, so anyone wants to go to England, it's a good year to do it.
I know I joined APT because I think it was free, and I had the requirement to have a guild. I also joined BIAPT, but it was free. I did find that I think during COVID they might have changed their view on emerging scholars because they realized the need for more stuff. Because I know Beth and Sean and I presented actually at APT the one year, did we not, Beth? If memory serves me. But BIAPT has been incredibly friendly and helpful with us as well, right? So they're just different.
I think
different
APT,
focus.
I don't want to give the impression they're like that now. They're not,
No.
and they've changed a lot. There's been some merciful retirements in the field.
Yeah, I get that. And I find them a little bit more, and I'll let Beth go next. I find them a little bit more practical, a little bit less theology, if you understand what I mean, than BIAPT is. So go ahead, Beth.
So Phil, my question is more, I'm going to try to think how to best word it. So just looking at your bio, you've had different areas of Canada in your experience. So as you look across the Canadian landscape and you think about practical theology in Canada, I guess my question is, as we're in the sort of this post-Christian context, what do you see as maybe the potential and the promise of practical theology for the future of the church in Canada? Not meaning necessarily the church as the established institute, right, of the church, but like people like me who are, working in, for want of a better term, a secular field. How do you see sort of practical theology seeping into areas across Canada, and what might you think are some of the main areas that could be practical theology could address or contribute to?
Yeah, what a great question. I think it should spark all of our imaginations to ask questions like that. The thing that just came to mind as you're talking was a news clip that I watched today on the increase of loneliness in men in North America. And it was about a 15-minute thing about men from, I think it was 10 years ago, have gone from 30% of them had male friends that they hung out with down to 5% in 2023. So only 5% of them said that they had close friends that they hung out with. And so this researcher was asking, why is that? What's happening? And I think it's partly COVID related, but it's many other factors as well. And I think that if we could tap into the cultural questions like that are human questions, they're not church questions, they're not anti-church questions, they're human questions that really need to be understood and worked on. I think that we make our work relevant. That's sort of what I meant by relevant when I used that idea. And I think that there's opportunity for us to be more creative in our selection of research topics and what we're offering, and invite others into it. I think we're too timid, culturally timid, and we need to be more engaged. And I think that the idea of church being more abrasive or anti-government or something like that isn't the right approach. I think we need to be like Daniel in the Old Testament, you know, sympathetic to the cause of human flourishing, and then figure out how our research could advance that.
Yeah, because essentially those are all kingdom questions, aren't they?
They are.
Like
And
when
I
you
think
think about the loneliness of men, which I'm sure is true of women too, it's a kingdom question. It's a kingdom issue. And so it totally makes sense that that would be something worth investigating. And
women were, in this study, apparently women were 20% more effective in developing friendships than men.
Mhm.
So there's something really big going on there.
Other questions? Anybody else have a question before we wrap up?
I have one other question. Do you find that, and other people can ask after this if they want, but do you find that practical theology done well has more of a chance to rock the boat in Christian circles than other research? Like, for example, if I do a PhD research and I'm parsing the Greek of one word, it's not going to rock a whole lot of boats. It might academically, but church world, it's not really going to have a wide splash, if you understand what I mean. But in the church, local church, practical theology has the chance that it might push some buttons and cause a little bit of disturbance in the force, I guess. Not that that's our goal, but I think when we're starting to challenge systems, that might happen.
I think maybe yes, but maybe no. I think we need all the disciplines, and we need, I think we need the work of biblical scholars still that shapes our imagination and our theological assumptions. And I think more than ever, we need to be clear about our approach to the Bible and so on. So I I think good practical theology requires a strong foundation in all of the disciplines. You need to know the Bible really well. You need to understand the Greek and Hebrew. You need to be able to articulate ethics and theology in a very profound way. And then you can play, you know, but you kind of have to have strong foundations. And I think that, you know, this wasn't the way you were talking about, Dale, but um, I think we're dependent on this other research to do our work. And
yeah, I wasn't necessarily meaning that to disparage him. What I meant was because we're dealing with how the church functions on its own, whether we bring these other things into it, which I hope we do, the Bible and theology and whatnot, we tend to be the practice part of it, right? The practice-led research. We're dealing with practice, so it has a chance to push some buttons that might be uncomfortable for some.
Yeah, and I think, you know, why are we afraid of that?
I agree.
To me, it's like we're in crisis, so let's use every strategy to overcome the crisis.
For sure. You're right. I'll let you have the last question, and then I'll wrap up with some announcements for the day.
Sure. I guess my question is practical theology practical enough? What do I mean by that? When I read some of the literature in practical theology, it's about research methods, it's about academic stuff. Whereas, for example, a conversation with an individual at BIAPT, actually after BIAPT, he ministers in an inner city context. And so he's talking about, you know, you can't give these people his clients, if you will, a Bible to read because they're illiterate. So there's a practical issue here of ministering to illiterate individuals, or if you're ministering to individuals with, say, drug addictions, or some of these challenging groups, practical theology is perhaps not talking about those kind of things as much as it's talking about how to do good research, or how to do, how to publish an academic paper, as opposed to getting into the trenches and getting your hands dirty in ministry day to day. I'm just wondering if there's a dimension of practical ministry that that needs to be strengthened in the discipline of practical theology.
I would say, Uriah, that there are streams of research that are much more aligned with that than maybe some of the textbooks that we require in the DPT program. If you follow Dorothy Bass and Craig Dykstra and those people, even Bonnie Miller McLemore kind of moves away from her academic sort of hat to more of her pastoral theologian hat. So there's a lot of work being done on day-to-day practices, on hospitality, on themes like that are really important and practical. So I think I've been saying to sort of the new students in the DPT program, you need to pick a lane that you're going to work in, and then that should be your lane. Don't go into all the lanes, because you won't be able to do it all. And I hope that more people choose that stream that you're talking about. But I think start with Dorothy Bass and all of the books related to life abundant, those kinds of approaches to practical theology. And there's a lot of literature there that is along the lines that you're indicating as necessary, and it's not ivory tower stuff at all. So
yeah,
it's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I use that as an example because the individual I was chatting with was kind of struggling a bit with how to craft a research proposal that was related to the context of his ministry.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and there are many other contexts where, the health field where Beth works, for example, and many areas where, wow, there's a lot of opportunity to be practical in theology.
Again, I think there are DMin programs that do that as well. And so, for some people, it may not be that they feel a calling to be a practitioner researcher. They just want to be a good practitioner. And so I think some of the DMin programs are designed more to support that kind of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, John Swinton's another one that has a lot of good stuff where he comes and gives practical as well. I put in the chat, Shelter Theology deals with homelessness by Susan Dunlap. Beth gave me the name of the author. She actually recommended the book for me, actually. So another great book that deals with practical theologian, but it's person boots on the ground, right?
Exactly.
So thank you very much, Phil. We appreciate you coming here today and providing us great speech. Yeah, it's great to see you as well. So next month, we're meeting on the third Wednesday of every month. So February 21st, 8 p.m. It's going to be a networking time. And so that's just for us to come and chat together, spend some time together, discuss what we're reading, what we're researching. And so I encourage you to do that. Speaking of reading, researching, and writing, if you have anything that you're going to get published, whether it's a book or articles or whatnot, please let us know so we can promote them for you. That was in the email, and we'd like to this place to be a conduit for that as well, to promote Canadian research. So please let us know. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We appreciate everyone coming along.
Just jumping in quickly to tag on to what Dale was mentioning, the following month. So just giving you a heads up, so what is it? January, February, March will be a presentation month. So we give 1 month in our rotation for people who are working on any kind of project that you might be ready to present your research or what you're studying that you'd like to get some feedback on, there's a way for you to submit your information to us regarding that. So if that's something you're interested in, you can go to our site. Dale, I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah, we'll be through the emails, but it's a Google
Yeah.
Doc that they'll have to fill out, and I'll send a link to that in the next email blast.
Okay.
So if you
And then,
want to
yeah,
be a part of that and want to present any research, maybe you're gearing up for a conference, gearing up for a major paper, your
or
dissertation.
your defense.
Yeah. By all means, let's be a sounding board for one another. And invite your friends.